Nobody set out to find a graveyard. That's the thing about research rabbit holes. You go in looking for one thing, and come out holding something you never expected, something that makes you question why certain chapters of history feel hollowed out, like someone carved the meat away and left only the bone. The original thread I was pulling was about intentional communities. Not cults, not religious movements exactly, but the dozens of social experiments that erupted across 19th century America. Places where groups of people walked away from conventional society and tried to build something from scratch. The Shakers, the Harmony Society, the Oneida Community, Brook Farm, Amana, names that surface occasionally in footnotes, usually described as interesting failures, quirky footnotes in the national story. But the further I mapped these communities, literally geographically plotted them, the more the footnote explanations started to crack. Here's the first thing that hit me. These communities didn't scatter randomly across the American landscape the way you'd expect if independent groups of idealists were separately arriving at the same conclusion. They clustered, densely, and the clusters weren't random either. Upstate New York, the Ohio River Valley, Southern California, specific corridors where, if you're at all familiar with what researchers call Tartarian architectural anomalies, you'll immediately recognize the overlap. Think about what that means. The same regions where enormous, ornate, inexplicably sophisticated 19th century structures appear, grand buildings in towns too small and too new to have built them, courthouses and exhibition halls with Baroque stonework in places that had no quarries, no skilled labor pools, no documented construction periods. Those same regions are where intentional communities concentrated most heavily. Maybe that's coincidence. Maybe. But then you start looking at the buildings these communities themselves constructed, and the coincidence theory starts looking a lot less comfortable. The Shakers are the cleanest example. Everyone knows the name, everyone's seen pictures of the furniture. Clean lines, elegant simplicity, pieces that have survived 2 centuries without replacement. What most people don't know is that Shaker structural architecture baffles professional engineers even today. Round barns, massive communal halls, thermal efficiency that predates modern insulation science. Acoustic chambers where a person speaking at normal volume in one corner can be heard clearly across a space that should swallow the sound. The standard explanation is folk ingenuity, trial and error, pious craftsmanship blessed by divine inspiration. But here's what that explanation can't account for. There was no learning curve. The first Shaker structures demonstrate the same engineering sophistication as the last ones. You don't see early attempts that are simpler, rougher, less refined. The knowledge arrived fully formed, as if it wasn't discovered, as if it was carried in. The same pattern surfaces in Oneida silverware and steel traps. The community's metalwork outperformed competitors in ways that contemporary manufacturers couldn't reverse engineer. Their steel held an edge longer. Their silver resisted tarnish through processes no one else could identify. When the community dissolved and transitioned to a corporate structure, the quality dropped almost immediately, not because the equipment changed, but because the people who understood the process were gone. The knowledge didn't transfer, it evaporated. The Amana colonies produced woolen textiles in the 1860s and 1870s, with thread counts and dye permanence that shouldn't have been achievable with the equipment they owned. When Amana converted to a conventional corporate model in 1932, the textile quality declined within a single production cycle. The machinery was the same, the workforce was largely the same, but whatever knowledge had been quietly operating at the center of production, that was gone. None of this makes sense under the failed idealism framework. But it makes a different kind of sense, if you're willing to ask a different question. What if these communities weren't experiments in building new societies? What if they were containers for people who came from somewhere else? People who carried knowledge, languages and memories that someone somewhere needed to quietly disappear. Consider the timeline. The first major wave of intentional community formation in America runs roughly 1840 to 1855. This overlaps almost precisely with the period researchers point to as the final erasure of Tartarian presence in North America, the moment when whatever that civilization was, whatever it built, was being absorbed, relabeled and written out of the official record. If that erasure was real, it created a problem. You can demolish buildings and burn documents, but you can't easily erase living people who remember, people who built those structures, who spoke the languages, who held the techniques in their hands and their muscle memory. You need somewhere to put them. Now look at how these communities handled documentation. In most historical contexts, records are the lifeblood of communal memory. Communities that survived on collective labor kept exhaustive accounts, crop yields, textile production, financial transactions down to the penny. And these communities did exactly that. They were meticulous record keepers in almost every domain, except one: origins, where members came from before they arrived. The Amana colonies enrolled over 1,000 members in their first decade and kept detailed records of every person, names, roles, work assignments, spiritual standing, but previous residences, prior family histories, documentation of life before the community, absent, systematically, consistently absent, not lost, not damaged, simply never recorded. The Oneida community maintained genealogical records, but the genealogies began at the moment of joining. Whatever life existed before was treated as if it had never happened. The Harmony Society enforced this as an explicit rule. Discussing a member's history before their arrival was a violation. Violation meant removal from the community. That's not institutional disorganization, that's active suppression. And if you're trying to hide people, to give them new identities, new histories, new lives that begin on a specific date and go no further back, that is exactly the administrative policy you design. Then there's the language problem, and this is where things get genuinely strange. Several of these communities developed their own internal vocabularies, which historians attribute to religious identity building, creating sacred terminology that reinforced group cohesion. Plausible on its face. But there are accounts from the 1860s and 1870s, journalists, investigators, curious travelers who visited these communities and left written records that describe something different, not invented religious vocabulary, something older. One journalist visiting the Amana colonies in 1872 described overhearing two elderly women in private conversation, speaking a language he couldn't identify. He was a seasoned traveler. He'd spent time across Europe and parts of Asia. He spoke German fluently, which was supposedly the community's heritage tongue. He wrote that what he heard bore no resemblance to German, or to any language he'd encountered in 4 continents of travel. When he asked about it, he was told it was Old German. Then the women went quiet, and shortly after, he was politely escorted out. The pattern in these accounts is consistent. Elderly members speaking among themselves in unidentifiable tongues, conversations ending the moment an outsider drew close enough to listen carefully, languages that died with their last speakers without passing to the next generation, not because no one tried to learn them, but because the teaching was deliberately withheld. Languages don't die by accident in tight-knit communities. They die when someone decides they should. The dissolution pattern is the final piece, and it's the most unsettling. Between 1895 and 1910, American intentional communities didn't decline. They didn't slowly hollow out as membership aged and new recruits stopped coming. They closed. Deliberately, rapidly, often in a span of months. The Harmony Society, which was genuinely wealthy, with successful industries and extensive landholdings, simply voted to dissolve in 1905 and distributed its assets. No crisis, no financial pressure, no external threat, just a decision. The ZOR separatists had survived for 80 years. They'd weathered the Civil War, multiple economic depressions, and the deaths of their founding leaders. Then in 1898, they voted to end. Same story, no precipitating event, just a conclusion. Across 5 states within 7 years, some of the most economically stable and functionally successful communities in American history shut themselves down. And when former members returned to ordinary life, and we're talking thousands of people who had lived radically different lives for decades, they didn't write memoirs, didn't give interviews, didn't join lecture circuits describing their extraordinary experiences. They went home and said nothing. That is not human behavior. People who survive transformative experiences talk about them. It's one of the most consistent things about human psychology across every culture. You tell the story. Unless the story isn't yours to tell, here's what I think was happening. And I want to be clear, I can't prove this. The documentation that would confirm it is precisely the documentation that's missing, and that absence feels less like negligence and more like architecture. The communities that emerged in the 1840s were built to receive people with knowledge they shouldn't have had, memories that contradicted the official timeline, skills that pointed to a civilization that wasn't supposed to have existed. They were given new identities, new histories beginning at their date of arrival, and a community structure that would make their isolation from mainstream society feel voluntary rather than enforced. The unusual construction knowledge wasn't folk ingenuity. It was professional competence carried forward by people who had learned it somewhere it was actually practiced. The metallurgical techniques weren't discovered through trial and error. They were already known. The languages weren't invented religious vocabulary. They were the surviving fragments of something older, something that was being spoken for the last time by the last people who remembered it. And when those people died, when the last of the original generation was gone, the communities had completed their function. The witnesses were dead, the knowledge was buried, the languages had died with their final speakers. There was nothing left to contain, so the containers closed. What lingers isn't the conspiracy, it's the craftsmanship. Those buildings are still standing. Some of them have been standing for 200 years without significant structural repair, in climates that are brutal on wood and stone and mortar. Modern engineers walk through them and come out puzzled, reaching for explanations that don't quite fit. Those buildings were built by farmers, by weavers, by people with no formal architectural training, according to every record we have, using techniques that didn't appear in any American construction manual for decades after the buildings went up. Either we've badly underestimated what ordinary 19th century Americans were capable of, or those buildings were built by people who were something other than what the records say they were. The communities are gone, the witnesses are gone, the languages are gone, the techniques for the most part are gone too, but the buildings remain, and a building is a kind of memory, one that doesn't speak in words but doesn't lie either. The question isn't whether these communities were connected to something larger than failed idealism. The question is what that something was, why its removal required this level of orchestration, and what it means that we were never supposed to ask.